Good morning, Trinity Church. If you would please make your way to your seats. We're going to start worshiping. Nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly trust in Jesus' name. Christ alone, cornerstone, strong in the Savior's love through the storm. He is Lord, Lord of all. When darkness seems to hide his face, I rest on his unchanging grace. In every high and stormy gale, my anchor holds within the veil. My anchor holds within the veil. Christ alone, strong in the Savior's love through the storm. He is Lord, Lord of all. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Savior's love. Come with trumpet sound, oh, may I then in him be found, dressed in his righteousness alone, faultless stand before the throne. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Savior's love through the storm. He is Lord, Lord of all. Christ alone, cornerstone, weak made strong in the Savior's love through the storm. He is Lord, sin begins to tell me all is lost, my guilt displayed, I will look and see my Savior, Jesus Christ, who bore my blame. And neither death nor life nor anything could ever keep me from His love. Hallelujah, grace shall reign eternally. None shall take me from the ranks of God's redeemed. His blood has forever ransomed me. What from Christ my soul shall sever, bound by everlasting bands, once in Him forever, His eternal covenant stands. And neither death nor life nor anything could ever keep me from His love. Hallelujah, grace shall reign eternally. None shall take me from the ranks of God. Sing hallelujah. Hallelujah, grace shall reign eternally. None shall take me from the ranks of God's redeemed. His blood has forever ransomed me. On such love my soul will ponder, love so great, so rich, so free. I say while I'm lost in wonder, why, oh Lord, such love through me? Hallelujah, grace shall reign eternally. None shall take me from the ranks of God's redeemed. Hallelujah, hallelujah, grace shall reign eternally. And none shall take me from the ranks of God's redeemed. His blood has forever ransomed me. Sing hallelujah. Hallelujah, grace shall reign eternally. None shall take me from the ranks of God's redeemed. His blood has forever ransomed me. Your blood speaks a better word than all the empty claims I've heard upon this earth. Speaks righteousness for me and stands in my defense. Jesus, it's your blood. Sing that again, your blood. Your blood speaks a better word than all the empty claims heard upon this earth. Speaks righteousness for me and stands in my defense. Jesus, it's your blood. What can wash away our sins? What can make us whole again? Nothing but the blood, nothing but the blood of Jesus. What can wash us pure as snow? Welcomed as the friends of God. Nothing but your blood, nothing but your blood, King Jesus. Your cross testifies in grace, tells of the Father's heart to make a way for us. Boldly we approach that earthly confidence. It's only by your blood. What can wash away our sins? And what can make us whole again? Nothing but the blood, nothing but the blood of Jesus. And what
Hello? Is this on? All right. Good morning, church. If you'd like to make your way back to your seats, today's reading is from Matthew 5, 1 through 20. Seeing the crowds, he went up on the mountain, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him. And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those in hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile and persecute you, and utter all kinds of evil against you, falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the heaven of kingdom. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven.
It's quite the verse at the end, isn't it? Sort of the mic drop, no pun intended. But when the text you're reading ends with that phrase, unless your righteousness exceeds the most righteous doing right people that you know, you're not going to get into the kingdom of heaven. It sort of makes you want to pay attention a little bit, doesn't it? So we should pray. Father, I pray that you'd help us to pay attention to your word. I pray that you'd help us as we rightly think, Lord, about, or try rightly to think about what a passage like this means. And to remember that we're in the midst of a conversation with you. You've been addressing us for a while. You are shaking our foundations. You are softening our hearts. So we pray, Lord, plant your seed deep within us, that we might bear fruit for you. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Martin Lloyd-Jones, if you remember this quote from last week, said, Christians, simply by being Christians, influence the world automatically. That was Lloyd-Jones' way of summing up the metaphors that we received last week, right? The idea of being salt and the idea of being light, which just by the nature of salt is to be salty. The nature of light is to be shiny. And because of those, if we really truly grasp that, we feel a certain burden. We're to influence, we're to protect and preserve, we're to illuminate. We're to be doing as believers what believers are to do. And salt isn't good for anything unless it's doing something, and light isn't good for anything unless it's revealed. And so in a similar way, we feel a certain call. But here's a question that hit me as I was reading this verse. Right? Verse 17 says, do not think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. And the question for me is, well, why would I think that? I mean, think about what we've heard so far. Where does verse 17 come from? It didn't immediately make sense to me. Now, because we've been reading through them, because this is a familiar sermon, some of you might know some of what's coming from verse 21 and on, right? You don't think you've killed people, but if you're angry, man, you still got a problem. You may not have committed adultery, but if you're giving yourself over to lust, you've still got a problem. And when it comes to your oaths, you think you meet all the I didn't sign my name the right way, so it doesn't count. Oh, come on. Jesus is desiring deep core change, realities that produce real life and real fruit. I mean, we've heard this call to meekness and purity and humility and peacemaking, right? But not just peacemaking, this is nice with your buddies, but peacemaking in the face of injustice, or mourning in the face of our failure, or hungering for this righteousness that God provides. And so far up to this point, my immediate question is, or my immediate thought is not, Jesus is looking to abolish the law. I mean, had you at any point thought that up till now? I mean, we've been making our way through these 16 verses. At any point were you feeling this sense of, something's wrong. He's trying to get rid of my Old Testament. I didn't have that gut either. I didn't know how to preach this passage when the fundamental first question isn't the first question I'm asking. So I cheated. I went to the end. I went to 7:28, and this is the end of the Sermon on the Mount. So Jesus comes up the mountain, everybody gathers, he sits down, begins to address his subjects. King is speaking from the hill. When he's done, 7:28 says this: when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were astonished at his teaching. And there's reason to be astonished. So far, I've been astonished because it's unpacking me at a deeper level. There's something about what Jesus has been saying that it's tearing me apart a little bit. I really like the idea of being successful and rich rather than the idea of mourning my failures and being poor in spirit. But that's not exactly why the teachers or the crowds were astonished. It says they were astonished, for he was teaching as one who had authority and not as their scribes. In other words, the way Jesus is coming at this whole idea of the law is just fundamentally different. It's completely backwards from the way the scribes did it. The scribes figured the way to get big righteousness is to do the little stuff perfectly. To use the forest and the tree mentality, they were experts at bark. But they got lost all the time. Jesus is coming as the one who planted the forest and said, I'm kind of familiar with the whole landscape. And so I want to talk to you in such a way that you get to use this analogy, if you've heard this one, you get your big rocks in first. This is a leadership principle. It's been out there for a decade or more, I'm sure. But the idea is pretty simple. If you've got big rocks and smaller rocks and tiny pebbles and sand, and you want to fit all of it into one big container, and you pour all the sand in first, and then you add in the pebbles, and you add in your smaller size stones, you're not getting everything in. Because there's no way to take the rock, the big boulder kind of issues, and stuff them down into that thing, because the minutia is taking up all the space. But if you do it in reverse, you take all your big rocks and you put all your big rocks into the container first, and you shake it down good. And then you take your medium-sized rocks and you let them kind of find their way. And then you take your smaller rocks and put them in and let them find their way. And then you can pour in some sand. Everything still fits. Jesus is kind of coming at the law that way. He's not worried the way that many of the scribes were when it comes to the idea of how far you can walk on the Sabbath. Do you agree with this scribe or do you agree with this scribe? Because who you agree with will determine a lot about what you say about the rest of this stuff. Jesus comes at it a completely different direction. So some of this is preemptive. he's going to say some things that start with this phrase. You've heard it was said to the people long ago, but I'm going to tell you this. So part of what he's saying here in verse 17 is a little bit, now don't hear what I'm not saying. But because he's been teaching in such a fundamentally different way, even through the first 16 verses, Jesus is needing to let people know, I am not here to take the entire Old Testament apart and to forget about it. Now, this phrase law and prophets deals with the 39 books that we currently know of as the Old Testament. And it's helpful to know that things are structured in a way that makes sense to us, but they're not entirely structured the exact same way in Jesus' day. For instance, last book of the Old Testament was the book Chronicles, which we wouldn't think. We know it as the Italian guy, right? Malachi. And I shouldn't have even tried. I don't even know why. So, but when Jesus says law and the prophets, he's basically meaning this. First 5 books of the Old Testament, more or less known as the law. But if you accept that designation of them as the law, then we're kind of missing a little bit of what was going on. Because as you know, we've gone through the book of Genesis. We've gone through the book of Exodus. There's a lot of stories in those. Even Numbers, which sounds like nothing but censuses and stuff like that. There's a lot of stories in there. There's stories that help connect the law in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And so the first 5 books are called the law. But because the prophets are really the ones who give the narrative of the rest of the Old Testament, even the historical books of the Old Testament are called the prophets. So when Jesus is saying, look at your Old Testament, look at your Bible, as he's talking to them, I want you to know, I didn't come to trash all this. But then he uses his magic word. I've come to fulfill it. And if you've been with us from the beginning, you know that the first time we opened up the pages of Matthew 5, it was important for us to look back at Matthew 1 through 4. And the thing that we've seen already is that Matthew is very much into this fulfillment kind of language. In fact, the point that Matthew's made from Matthew 1 through Matthew 4, before Jesus enters up onto the mountain, is that this isn't the first time you've heard the story of Jesus. As Matthew's told Jesus, the Son of God came to the earth. He went down to Egypt. He came up out of Egypt through the water into the wilderness and to a mountain. And if you just think about that story, it sounds a lot like the story of Israel. Israel, called God's son, was down in Egypt, brought from Egypt through the water, out to the wilderness, and then up to a mountain. But the problem with Israel's story is that though God was a faithful father, Israel was a horrible kid. At every point that Israel was invited to obey God, they failed. And the story of the mountain is as clear a story as you could get. God brings everybody to the mountain. He goes up. He just says 10 things. He's got a lot more to say, but he just says 10. And they drop the ball on the first one and the second one. Forget 3 through 10. They can't even do anything God has said. And that becomes part of the story of the Old Testament. Though God is faithful, Israel's unfaithful. And their story needs to be rewritten. And so Matthew's coming along and saying, we need a new son from Egypt into the wilderness to the mountain so that God's people can be addressed once again. And Jesus comes and fulfills every point of the story up till now. So when we come to verse 17 and you've been reading Matthew, you've heard this word fulfill quite a bit. And in fact, what Matthew's shown us is that the idea of fulfilling, Jesus fulfilling the law, isn't some small little thing. This idea of fulfillment language it's just packed with meaning. So as we look this through, and I kind of got into it before really introducing it this way, but there's 4 questions I sort of asked as I was making my way through. I thought we could kind of ask these together and understand these 4 verses, 17 through 20, a little bit better. One we've already asked, the first question, right? Why would these people think that? Well, partially because of Jesus' way of teaching, partially because things are a little bit preemptive, partially because Matthew's already sort of used this language a little bit. But then Jesus gets to the point of verse 18, and it sort of a second question in my mind started to be asked. If Jesus came to fulfill the law and not to abolish it, the second question is then, well, what would that look like? And so Jesus says in verse 18, well, truly, I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not and these are two words we use the word dot, certainly, but this is the Hebrew equivalent of kind of you crossing your T's and dotting your I's. They're the two smallest symbols that can be written in Hebrew. And so what Jesus is saying, just by pointing out the way that they write their alphabet, the smallest little parts of the smallest little letters, even to that level of minutia, the law matters. And all of it is going to be accomplished. None of it is going to have to be whited out from the law. We're not going to have to sort of just, well, that was a bad part of our history. We'll just ignore that. Just tear out that page and we'll all forget that happened. No. Every little bit of Israel's story, every little bit of God's revelation up till this point is going to be accomplished. And this is where it gets very interesting. What Jesus is saying is that he, in his very existence, not simply in his obedience. It's going to be true in his obedience. There will have never been a man before Jesus, and there will never be a man since Jesus who will live a human life the way that the law asked it to be led. And Jesus did it. So on the very level of his obedience, Jesus certainly does fulfill the entire bit of the law. I asked you during worship to think about your last week. Here's the amazing thing. Jesus never had a week like that. He never had a week where at the end of it, they had to look back and go, oh God, would you forgive me? Isn't that amazing? No little crossing the T kind of sins. No little dots over the I kind of sins. Everything perfectly obedient. One man in history. And the great news of the gospel is simply this. He came to stand in your place. He came to be your ambassador. If you had to be known by somebody, I mean, you've all been known by somebody you'd rather not be known by, right? You've got one of those relatives you introduce to somebody who immediately meets your friend and starts to ask them really embarrassing questions. And afterwards they're like, so that's one of your relatives, huh? Yeah, we're not totally proud of that guy in the family, but he's here and there we are. This is like the exact opposite of that. If you could be known by anyone, if you could be represented by anyone, if you could be connected to anyone, wouldn't you want to be connected to this man simply because of his obedience? But there's more. It's not just Jesus' obedience that fulfills the law. It's his existence. Isn't that part of what we've seen in Matthew so far? Out of Egypt I called my son. Jesus fulfilled that passage. How? There was nothing for him to obey. No. It was him being there. We already had one guy take a shot at being the representative of humanity, and Adam doesn't have a great reputation. We already had one group be known for the people of God, and Israel doesn't have a great reputation in that sense either. I don't know why I'm having trouble with that word. But the story of Jesus arriving on the planet looks back at everything in the Old Testament prior and says there were echoes of Jesus all along. Every time we've been listening to his story, as we've been reading through Genesis, he's the creator, Colossians says, who then merged with his creation. From Genesis 3, Jesus is the heel crusher in the garden. Later on, as we meet Abraham and Isaac, we see in Jesus the true son who trudged up a hill like Isaac, carrying what was necessary for his own sacrifice. At the end of Genesis, Jesus is the one who could say with Joseph, but with so much more meaning, you meant all this for evil, but God meant it for good and for the salvation of all. We make our way into Exodus. He's the one, Moses sort of radiated God's face a little bit, Jesus bears God's image perfectly. Hebrews says that Moses over all of Israel is like the best servant ever, but Jesus comes in like the son in the household. Not like the chief steward, but like the rightful heir of all of it. In Leviticus, he's called the greater priest, not from a corrupt order like that of Aaron, but from a perfect order like that of Melchizedek. He's seen as the new tabernacle. He's the new dwelling place of God. In Numbers, there's this echo of him as the rock who's struck to bring forth life-giving waters. In Deuteronomy, he's this one here now in Matthew 5 who's speaking from a mountain, bringing God's new covenant. We go to Joshua, and Jesus is the true conqueror who not only leads us to battle, but he's the one who never once let God's law depart from his mouth, which was the command given to Joshua in the first place. And he's the one who truly fights our battles for us. Well, you get to Judges, and all there is failure. And Jesus is there. He's there in the ache of every time that people are crying out to God, not even knowing what they're crying for. And he's there in every judge who comes to lead a rebellious people back to God. He's a kinsman redeemer out of the book of Ruth who spends everything for our rescue. And if you've ever read the Jesus Storybook Bible, you know I'm just pilfering from that. Let me read you one. Let's be a lot more deliberate in our plagiarism. This is the story of the teeny weeny king. God's people had a new land, and now they wanted a king. But God is your king, Samuel told them. He's the one who looks after you best. We want a real king, they said, one we can see. God knew that a king might not be kind to his people or look after them as well as he would, but God's people didn't care. They wanted a king, and they wanted him now. So God gave them a king. He was called Saul, and he seemed like a good king at first, but he became proud and stopped listening to God. He didn't obey God or love God with his whole heart. Saul can't help me with my plan, God said. I need a king who loves me and will teach my people to love me. I need a true king. And God had just the one in mind. Go to Bethlehem, God told Samuel. You'll find the new king there. Samuel's job was to listen to God and tell people what God said. So Samuel went to the little town. God told Samuel to go to Jesse's house. Now, God was going to choose one of Jesse's sons to be the new king. Jesse had 7 strong sons. Now, in those days, if you were going to be king, you didn't have to be the richest or the cleverest, although that was always nice. You had to look like a king, which meant you had to be the tallest and the strongest, so you could carry the longest swords and biggest armor and defeat everyone. And it didn't hurt to be handsome either. Samuel asked Jesse to bring him each son in turn. So Jesse brought the oldest, tallest, strongest son. This must be the new king, Samuel thought. He looks like a king. But God didn't choose him. You're thinking about what he looks like on the outside, God told Samuel, but I'm looking at his heart, what he's like on the inside. So Jesse showed Samuel his next oldest, tallest, strongest son, but God didn't choose him either. In fact, God didn't choose any of the 7 sons. Samuel says, is that all? Well, Jesse laughed. There's the youngest son, but he's the weakling of the family. Is only teeny. Bring him, said Samuel. So Jesse's youngest son came running up, and God spoke quietly to Samuel, this is the one. His name was David. He has a heart like mine, God said. It's full of love. He will help me with my secret rescue plan, and one of his children's children's children will be the king, and that king will rule the world forever. Samuel anointed David's head with oil, which was a special way to show that you're God's chosen king. You will be the new king one day, Samuel told him. And sure enough, when he grew up, David became king. God chose David to be king because God was getting his people ready for an even greater king who was coming. Once again, God would say, go to Bethlehem. You'll find the new king there. And there, one starry night in Bethlehem, in the town of David, 3 wise men would find him. Do not think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I haven't come to abolish them, but fulfill them. Now, we should just buy a bunch of these books because they're fabulous. We can all read at a higher level than this, but I'm not sure we ever get a higher truth than this. He's everywhere. Not in some hokey way where we're trying to make things work, and we just sort of twist an analogy around. But when we recognize that the divine creator authored the Bible, it shouldn't be surprising that everything fits. And how everything fits. It just fits so well. I want to check on our time. I think we're good on time. So here's what we're going to do. I want us to watch one video. This is, we're going to plagiarize again. This is from the Bible Project. They've got a good way of us thinking through what's called the continuity between the Old and New Testament. And this is a good background to it. So we got that video? All right. Monaco, do you mind hitting the lights for us? Thanks a lot.
You're most likely familiar with the 10 Commandments in the Bible, stuff we generally take as good advice. Don't murder, don't steal, honor your parents, the list goes on.
And those are just the first 10. There are actually a total of 613 commands, all given to ancient Israel, found in the first 5 books of the Bible, which in Hebrew are called the Torah.
Now the word Torah is usually translated in English as the law, because it has all of these laws in it. And as you read through them, you wonder, am I supposed to obey some of these, all of these? I mean, what's the purpose of the law?
Well, that translation is kind of confusing because while the Torah has laws in it, the book itself is fundamentally a story about how God is creating new kinds of people who are fully able to love God and love others. And when Jesus taught about the Torah, he said that he was bringing that story to its fulfillment.
So walk me through the story and how it's fulfilled.
So the story begins with God creating humanity who rebels. And God chooses Abraham to bless all of the nations through his family, who end up in slavery down in Egypt, and so God rescues them. Then at Mount Sinai, God makes a covenant with Israel, like an agreement. And all of the laws that Moses gives to Israel are the terms of that agreement. They're like a constitution. And so some of the laws, they're about rituals and customs that set Israel apart from the nations. Other laws are about social justice or morality. And by following these, Israel would show the other nations what God is like.
Okay, so the rest of the Torah is just the complete list of laws that Moses gives Israel?
No, the rest of the Torah just continues the story. And the 613 commands are only a selection from that original constitution. And even these have been broken up and placed at strategic points within the story. Now pay attention, because you'll see a really clear pattern. Moses gives the first laws to Israel.
Yeah, don't worship other gods, don't make idols.
And then right after that, there's a story of Israel breaking those very laws.
Yeah, they worship the golden calf.
And so Moses gives some more laws, and then you get more stories of rebellion. Some more laws, rebellion again, some more laws, more rebellion, and you start to see the point.
Right, no matter how many laws, they're just going to continue to rebel.
So at the conclusion of the Torah's story, Moses gives this final speech to Israel as they prepare to go into their new home. And he tells them, you guys, I know that you're not going to follow all of God's laws. You've proven to me that you're incapable. And Moses says the problem is that their hearts are hard and that they're going to need new, transformed hearts if they're ever going to truly follow God's law. And he was right. I mean, the story goes on to recount Israel's total failure.
They go into the land, they break all the laws.
Right. Now, the next section of books in the Jewish tradition are the 15 books of the prophets, and they reflect back on the story. For example, Ezekiel, he said that if Israel was ever going to obey the law, God's Spirit would have to transform their hard hearts into soft hearts. And Jeremiah said that's when obedience to God's commands wouldn't feel like a duty, but they would be written deep in their hearts. And Isaiah, he promised a future leader, Israel's Messiah, who will lead all of the people in obedience to the law. Now, in Jewish tradition, all of these books together are called the prophets, even the historical books, because they're continuing the story told from the perspective of the prophets.
Okay, so we have the law and the prophets, and they're telling one connected story about God's desire to bless the whole world through a people, Israel, who it turns out needs a new heart.
Yes, and Jesus saw himself as continuing that story. So he agreed with the law and the prophets when he taught that it's out of the human heart that come the most ugly parts of human nature. It's like the default setting of our hearts is opposed to God's law. But Jesus also said that he came to solve that problem, and in his words, to fulfill the law.
So what does he mean there, to fulfill the law?
Well, first he said that the demand of all of the laws in the Torah could be fulfilled by what he called the Great Command, that we are to love God and to love others.
So that seems pretty easy. I mean, we all want to love.
Well, we think we want to love. But Jesus showed how love is far more demanding than we realize. So he quotes the law, do not murder. And he says, yes, not killing someone is a very loving thing to do. But then he also says that when you treat someone with disrespect, or when you nurse resentment against them, you're also violating God's moral ideal, because you're not treating that person with love. And so Jesus said true love ought to extend even to our own enemies. So even though this command seems very simple, Jesus showed how our hearts are not currently equipped to fulfill even this basic command of God to love others.
And that's kind of a downer.
But where Israel failed, Jesus brought this story to its fulfillment. As Israel's Messiah, he fully loved God and others, and he showed all of the nations what God is truly like. He did this through his acts of compassion and mercy, and ultimately by loving his enemies even unto death. And after his resurrection, he told his followers that he would send God's Spirit to transform their hearts so that they could follow him and fulfill the purpose of the law, to love God and to love their neighbor. So this fulfills the story of the law and the prophets, or in the words of the Apostle Paul, the one who loves fulfills the law. This video...
There he is. It's always dangerous to play those in the middle because he says everything way better than you can. So there we are. Just a little asterisk over what's coming next. Now, so you get how this plays in. The video kind of sets us up for where we're going, doesn't it? This is Israel failing, Jesus coming to fulfill the story. And in it, the question that we have to ask is, okay then, so can we just go big picture obedience? Or how pervasively does this have to really apply to our lives? And that's where we get to this third question. So for me, the third question I had to ask was, so what should we do then? And that's where verse 19 comes in. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Verse 19 continues, though, whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So the question that we might immediately jump to, right, is, okay, so of the 613 that he referenced, how many do we have to obey? And there's certainly discussions out there to be had about the way that the law given to Israel was not just given to govern a religious body. This was governing a nation. And it was intended to govern a nation that was comprised of some Israelites who actually wanted to follow God and some Israelites who didn't care about God and just were part of the nation and needed to be governed, right? You don't find your heart warmed by the 35-mile-an-hour speed limit, I'm sure. But it governs you. No matter the condition of your heart, the law governs you. And there were some parts of the Old Testament law that simply governed people. And Jesus is going to address a few of those over these next few weeks with us. There were certainly, there were certainly some parts of the law that governed more purity and a ceremonial nature of how we got in. But with this idea of getting the big rocks in place, Jesus is going to set our agenda. We don't immediately have to take this question to, so do we eat pork or not eat pork? Because that's not where Jesus goes in the conversation next. We're just going to follow him in his sermon. And where he goes next is big rocks. So we're going to follow him to big rocks. And trust me, that's going to get down to the little nitty-gritty. He's going to address us on anger and lust. He's going to address us on oaths and loyalty. He's going to address us on revenge and love. And overall, the question is, are we seeking God? Which takes us back to the title of this whole thing. As we seek God first, everything else falls in. The big rocks get in place first, and all the rest of the law is going to work its way. Thank you so much, son. What a handsome young man. My firstborn, he could be king. He's got a good heart too. So I don't think I'm just inventing this out of Matthew chapter 5, though. Okay, I'm not trying to be so narrow into this one and ignore the wealth of other things. Jesus later on in Matthew says this: "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin, but you've neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. And it's not as though the scribes or the Pharisees at that point were going, well, who said that justice, mercy, and faithfulness are the big things? Who says, you're right, Jesus. Maybe the cumin's the big thing. It didn't play that way, and here's why. Jesus is just borrowing from so much of the Old Testament. David in the Psalms, or Jeremiah, or Zechariah, or Micah in the prophets said these things. We're skipping a slide here. We'll get to the question for it in a second. This is from the Psalms. All his works are done in faithfulness. He, and this is speaking of God, he loves righteousness and justice. Jeremiah, God asked Jeremiah this question: see if you can find a man who does justice and seeks truth. Zechariah says, render true judgments and show kindness and mercy to one another. Or the one from Micah that you probably have in your head as I'm quoting these other ones, right? He's told you, O man, what's good. What does the Lord require of you? But to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. God has identified the big rocks. Jesus is going to re-identify them here. In Matthew 23, then, he condemns the scribes who had heard this teaching and decided to ignore him for the last 3 years. And he's still coming back at him and saying, man, you guys are still missing the boat. I've been preaching for a while, and you're still going after the little stuff, and you're just missing the big stuff altogether. Why does this matter? Because it takes us back to our final question. The thing that hits us right at the end, the exclamation point at the end of this verse. And the question I ask is, well, who can accomplish this? Because here's the verse again. I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. And immediately, those who were there that are thinking, who are the most righteous people you know? And they're going to those who follow all the little details of the law. They're saying, man, those guys are the smartest people. Those guys are the most righteous people. And Jesus, you're telling me I've got to be more righteous than them? Who could get this done? This is like Jesus having the conversation with Nicodemus. Remember? Nicodemus has been curious about Jesus. He comes to him in the middle of the night, and Jesus says, yeah, so you need to be born again. And Nicodemus, in like a stupid moment, says, I got to climb back in my mom. And Jesus is like, yeah, come on, man. Just remember your Old Testament. You got to be born of water. You got to be born of the Spirit. And in the middle of that, when Nicodemus finally gets, oh, you're not talking about something physically impossible. You're talking about changing me, changing us at a core, deep level, not just cleansing me, but purifying me inside out. He asks, who could do this? This is Paul in Romans. And he's going after, he's laying out his case that everybody's guilty. Doesn't matter if you're Jew, doesn't matter if you're Gentile, doesn't matter if you obey all the law. He says this, right? He says, you who preach against stealing, do you steal? No. Well, you who preach against adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? And the immediate answer is, probably. I mean, like, if Paul's talking to some of his peers, Paul didn't do that. But what Jesus has already unpacked for Paul and that Paul's trying to redrive down is, yeah, you do. Because anytime you've harbored bitterness, anytime you're just messing with the way you can get out of an oath, anytime that you're looking lustfully, you are harboring a terrorist against the Lord in the deep recesses of your heart, and this isn't going to go well. So your righteousness doesn't have to be better than the Pharisees in the sense of all this other stuff. But if all this stuff points to Jesus, then trust me, we don't want to get rid of any of it. We want to see it in its proper place. We want to see our proper relationship to all these laws. But if all of them point to Jesus, well, let's just wring them out like sponges for everything we could get. If you're out in the wilderness and you're just dying of thirst and somebody offers you a sponge, you're not going to just lick the outside and go, oh, that kind of helped. You're going to take it and you're going to wring it out over top of you and just try to get everything you can. Guys, we need nothing like we need Jesus. And if the whole Old Testament is just, he's contained in it and we got to go and find him and then wring it out, then we're not doing what Paul says in the same passage. He says, you who boast in the law, you dishonor God. Guys, we don't come to the law ever to boast. That's been pretty obvious. The law indicts, it doesn't congratulate. But we do come to wring it out to get as much of Jesus as we can. Because he says he's not taking any of it away, but he's bringing all of it to completion. Now, Brad mentioned before that one of the ways that I've been kind of aware that we as a church have sort of missed out on a big rock. It's kind of like I was listening to a guy on the radio. He was an African-American guy, and he was talking about meeting somebody who went through the resistance. And he showed him a scar on his arm. He said, I got this from the resistance, brother. And the guy who was telling the story said, man, I just felt immediately ashamed because I realized there's no sacrifice I've made like what this guy's made. And when I talk to some in the pro-life movement, when I talk to some who've been through real points in our history of trying as Christians to push back and say, if babies that are unborn are alive, they're worthy of protection, they're worthy of justice, and they're worthy of righteousness because they're human, and that's really the only fundamental question. And if they're human, like we've done other things of recapturing people's dignity because they're human too, women are human, all races are human, and so whether you're born or unborn, you're still human, then there ought to be righteousness, and there ought to be dignity, and there ought to be real sense of justice for all humans. I look at our own individual story and I say, guys, at least over my tenure here, I haven't done a great job of keeping this front and center in our lives. We've existed as a church for almost 2 decades. And over our personal 2 decades of history, we haven't done a lot of pro-life kind of work. But there are many, yearly, daily, who are denied justice in our country. And I thought this is a good time for us to remember we want to be pro-life. But the other way, so we're going to hear from Bob Hershey, who's the executive director, the chief administrative director, the head honcho over the Cleveland Crisis Pregnancy Center. He's going to talk to us a little bit about the work that they've been doing. They're the ones that we were collecting money for in the baby bottle. And then after that, we're going to celebrate and care for a couple that's also been robustly pro-life, because on the fostering side, this is the last week we as a church will be able to spend with little Paxton. Paxton, who's been with Brian and Stephanie Fitz, is going to be going back to his birth mother. And this is, they were able to work out one Sunday we could be with him for our final, more than likely our final time. And so we're going to hear from Bob. We're gonna sing, and then we're going to take time to just be able to hear from Brian and Steph, and we're going to pray for them at the end. So can we welcome up Bob Hershey here? I think you're good.
I'd rather call myself humble servant, but yeah, I take the position of executive director. So thank you for having me back again. It was nice to even be recognized as I walked in the door. Hey, weren't you here like a couple weeks ago getting the bottle? So thank you guys for even just recognizing who I was and who I represent. I talked to Darren this week, and Sorry, I don't know what it is about this morning, but it's been an emotional morning. Not a lot of sleep last night. I woke up a number of times just praying about this morning, and there's a retreat weekend that's going on that really has an effect on men's lives this weekend, and praying about that too. So I kind of just came from that a little bit. But when Darren and I were talking this week, I shared with him my story and why God has called me to the pregnancy center. It's not often that I share my story with the church, but it's my story. And pretty much everybody that's involved with pregnancy center work has some kind of story. There's some kind of story. And so I'm going to share my story with you today. And Darren, thanks for asking me to, and to invite my wife too, because she hasn't really heard me share our story in front of everyone. And so I think that's what's... So story goes back. We had just graduated high school and headed off to college. So we're in just the first semester or so of college, and we find ourselves pregnant. She comes from a Catholic background. I come from a Baptist background, and truly knowing that life is sacred, and so have the faith background. And yet, when you're faced with pregnancy, now you have a decision to make. And so we became pregnant, and and I hear this on the phones all the time, because we have women that call in, I need an abortion, and some of them will say, before this happened to me, when I was over here, I was always pro-life, and that wasn't what I was going to do. But now that I'm in this situation, now it's kind of weighing on me, and I don't know what to do, because there's always this other option. So we went through those same thoughts. We knew that after our years at college, we were going to get married. It was just the way our relationship was. But yet, now that we're pregnant, what do? There is that other option. So we went to a doctor, and my mind just kind of goes blank when we went to the doctor. I don't know if it's the guide piece of me or what it is, but I just kind of went blank. And when we were there, the doctor looked at us and he said, you know what, you guys are two young, intelligent people, and you guys can figure this out, and you can do this. And so we went back to the car, and I kind of wake up after that happens. And I looked at her and I said, you know what? I need to step up. This is my responsibility, and we need to get married. There are many out there right now going to those doctors, those OBs, and saying, you don't have to do this. You can get an abortion and take care of it. What if, in my case, that didn't happen? That I would have gone to one of those doctors that said, just take care of it. I wouldn't have I wouldn't have the 3 children that I have and their wives and husband. I wouldn't have 4 grandchildren. I wouldn't have been married 40 years just 2 weeks ago. It's an amazing story of God's grace on my life that saved me from a mess. And it's a reason he's put me in the place that I'm at. Because I can look at those guys walking through those doors and go, man, I've been in your shoes. I know what you're thinking. Quit thinking it. Is it hard? Yeah, absolutely, it's hard. But you know what? You can do it. I mean, I did it. So God's put me in a place where we are ministering not only to women, because this has always been a women's ministry kind of a thing. You know, but it's been a women's ministry kind of a thing for a long, long time. And we can always put the fire out on the other side and take care of the women and take care of the child. But what are we doing for the guy that's holding the match on this side, that's starting the fire? The match has got to be taken away from the guy. One thing that I continue to say is that, you know what? If we can solve the guy problem, we've pretty much solved the girl problem, for the most part. Not all of it, but for the most part. So guys, I'm asking you, each and every one of you sitting here today, there's a guy in your life that you need to feed into. Maybe it's you need to be equipped. We at the center are trying to equip churches because there are going to be guys, there are going to be girls that are coming up to you and saying, man, you know what? There's a girl that I know that's pregnant at school. There's a girl in the youth group that's pregnant. And I don't know how to have that conversation. She's thinking about abortion. What do I say? How do I say that? You know what? Let us come alongside you and help you in those conversations. Because you guys are on the front lines. It's not us on the front lines. There's only so many people going to walk through my door. You guys are on the front lines. And if we're saying we're pro-life, we've got to understand how to have those conversations. So please use us to be able to help you. We want to be a resource for you guys. When I carried that bottle out of here 2 weeks ago, you guys had $637.32 or something like that in there. I don't know, something like that. That bottle was heavy. So thank you guys for knowing that life is special and precious, for feeding into us that way, that we can feed into those guys and the girls that walk through our doors. We really appreciate the partnership and what you guys are saying about pro-life. So thank you for that. I also want to speak to the fact that there's a program that we have that there are many women. The stat is, and I'm just going to throw this out there, the stat is that there are 4 in 10 women in a congregation that have had an abortion. And if that doesn't rock your world, I'm not sure what's going to. That there are people in the church that are getting abortions. And that's why I say you guys are on the front lines, because they need somebody to go to, somebody to talk with. And so one of the things that we do, we have a HEART program. It's healing the effects of abortion-related trauma. It is a healing workshop that's 7 weeks. There are women that have been through abortion that are leading, that have gone through the program and now are leading the program also. And so if you might be one of those, I put some brochures back on the back there. Take a brochure, and there is a number in there. Call the number. It gets directed to us. I will get you in touch with the lady that's in charge of our HEART program. It's amazing seeing the healing in these ladies that have gone through, and seeing the healing, the shame that's taken away, the condemnation that's been taken away, and the healing that takes place. And so if that's you, please call the number. I know I've talked to 2 ladies in the last week that I put them in touch with them, and I never find out names, or I couldn't tell you who has gone through the program. It's all confidential, but I send them to this number, and they call Lisa, and they make an appointment, and they set up a time to have these sessions. So I would encourage you to do that. Again, Trinity Church, thank you so much for allowing me time to share my story. It's a blessing. Thank you, guys.
You'd all stand. We're going to finish up with one more worship song here. Lord, I come, I confess, bowing here, I find my rest, and without you, I fall apart. You're the one who guides my heart, and Lord, I need you. Oh, I need you. Every hour I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you. Where sin runs deep, your grace is more. Where grace is found is where you are. And where you are, Lord, I am free. Holiness in Christ in me. And Lord, I need you. Oh, I need you. Every hour I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you. Lord, I need you. Lord, I need you. Oh, I need you. Every hour I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you. Teach my song. Teach my song to rise to you. When temptation comes my way, and when I cannot stand, I'll fall on you. Jesus, you're my hope and stay. Teach my song. Teach my song to rise to you. When temptation comes my way, and when I cannot stand, I'll fall on you. Jesus, you're my hope and stay. And Lord, I need you. Oh, I need you. Every hour I need you. My one defense and my Every hour I need you, my one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you.
If Jesus came to fulfill this story and then recruits us into it, it is right for us to honor those who have been playing a part. So we're glad to have the Hersheys here with us. I don't think they're just scooting right out afterwards. So if you want to talk with them, they're going to be around, and we'll be able to have some time, not just to catch up with them today, but we'll definitely be inviting them back. The baby bottle's going to make an appearance again between Mother's Day and Father's Day. See if we can beat our 600-something number. Get 1,600 something or 6,000, who knows? But we have other heroes in this fight with us, and I think the cry of one of their hearts is, Lord, we need you today, and we want to be the body with them. So it's going to take a little bit longer, but I'm going to ask that you sit down. I know this is when I normally dismiss you. Not yet. I want to instead